Okay, so with this presentation, we're going to go over some of the basic characteristics of bacteria. And now when we typically think of bacteria, we think of germs and growth and disease, and really that's kind of a missed stereotype of bacteria. Most bacteria are fairly harmless. Of course, the ones that do cause disease, kind of scare us for good reason. But let's go and look at some of the basic features. So when we look at the cell structure, probably the most obvious difference of bacteria versus other organisms on Earth is bacteria are classified as prokaryotes. You've seen the term prokaryote many times this school year, so I hope you're fairly comfortable with it. But a prokaryote, again, it's a cell without a nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. When you look at the picture here, you can see very few parts from earlier in the school year. There's no vacuoles, there's no endoplasmic reticulums or Golgi bodies or mitochondria or chloroplasts or lysosomes. Those are all membrane-bound organelles. There's no nucleus. The nucleus is a membrane-bound organelle. So prokaryotes are very simple in structure, very basic. And you can see that there is blue strands of DNA in the picture, and they're just kind of floating freely in the cytoplasm. Well, they do have ribosomes, and if you recall from earlier in the school year, ribosomes' job is to create a protein. So if they do have ribosomes, that tells me that ribosomes are not membrane bound. If you recall from earlier in the school year, we mentioned ribosomes are made from rRNA, ribosomal RNA. And so watch this animation. Here we have a strip of A's, U's, C's, and G's at the bottom of the picture. That's messenger RNA. And the letters AUG is the start codon. And transfer RNA just delivered an amino acid. Well, if you remember from our next chapter, the ribosome just goes down from codon to codon to codon. So now that the ribosome has moved to the next codon, AGG, transfer RNA will bring the proper amino acid. And one by one, the ribosome just goes down one codon at a time. So now the ribosome is at UUC. If you remember that amino acid chart, you could look up UUC. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head, but tRNA brings over an amino acid, and now this growing chain of amino acids is larger and larger and larger. This again is the process of translation. So the ribosome moves down to the next codon, CAA, and transfer RNA brings over another amino acid. And ultimately, we eventually come to the stop codon. UAA as a stop codon. If you recall, a protein is simply a chain of amino acids. So a ribosome's job is to build proteins through the process of translation. And yes, bacteria and prokaryotes have them. When we look at this animation, we see how many bacteria are able to swim, how they're able to move. They have a flagella, which is a cell part that you can see in the animation just kind of twists and corkscrews, and that provides the whip-like motion for bacteria to propel themselves through their liquidy environment. If we come back to this picture right here, we see these yellow hairs that go all around the cell. Sometimes students will mistake them for cilia because we learned cilia earlier in the school year kind of look like this. And cilia are used for motion and movement, kind of like the flagella. However, these are called pili. Pili is the plural version. Pilus is singular. But pili is the plural version, and these prokaryotes have pili, which acts as an anchor. And you're also going to see another important role when we look at the sex life of bacteria. Pili play a role in bacteria and their sex lives. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And you saw on the previous picture, and you'll see that previous picture again, but bacteria have 3 outer layers. One reason why they're so difficult, and you can see the 3 outer layers in this picture here. One reason why they're so difficult to treat is that they have not one, not two, but three outer layers for defense. Their outer layer is called a capsule. And you can see in this picture here it's labeled green. Now, not all bacteria, I don't think all bacteria have a capsule, but we'll talk about gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria another day. But bacteria have this outer layer called a capsule, and it just adds to their protection. And when we look at this picture, we see something really interesting. We don't see this in eukaryotic cells, but when times are harsh, an endospore can grow and surround the DNA of the bacteria. And everything on the outside of the endospore can very well die in this harsh environment. Maybe it's too dry or there's too much radiation from the sun. But ultimately what's inside the endospore has a good chance of surviving. So when the environment becomes more hospitable, the endospore will just grow into a new cell, and because the DNA was protected, the bacteria goes about its life. So it's a real neat little adaptation that some bacteria have. This is called an endospore. If we just bring the picture back up again, if you want to take a look at some of the prokaryotic parts that are common to bacteria, this is a really nice picture. You can see the three outer layers, the capsule in gold, the cell wall in green, and the cell membrane in gray. And again, the main thing to note when you browse over the picture is no membrane-bound organelles, no mitochondria, no vacuole, no nucleus. So this is the basic structure of bacteria cells. So the next thing I want to look at is some of the basic shapes that we see with bacteria. Well, bacteria often grow in colonies, so they often will live in groups, and that's what a colony is, a group of bacteria cells. And from the picture you can see that there are three basic shapes in the picture. You have a science word and then the common word. Of course, if you're in my class, I want you to know the science word. So on the top right, it says bacillus, rod shape. In my notes, it says bacilli, rod shaped. Well, the difference in spelling is simply the singular version, bacillus, and in the notes, bacilli is plural. So bacilli is plural, bacillus is singular. When you look at the picture on the left, in the picture it says spherical cocci, but in my notes it says spherical coccus. Again, that's just the plural versus the singular. Cocci is plural, coccus is singular. They both mean spherical. And the bottom right-hand corner picture, in the picture it says spirella, helical, or spiral. Spirella is the plural version. Spirellum, like it says in the notes right there, spirellum is the singular version of the word. So the words mean rod, spherical, and spiral shaped. Of course, I want you to know the science words. And so when you look at this bacteria right here, this is a bacteria called Lactobacillus acidophilus. And when you look at the spelling of the word lactobacillus, you can figure out, okay, you can see in the picture that it's rod-shaped. And again, in the name of the bacteria, you can see the word bacillus, which means rod. Here's a bacteria called Streptococcus pneumoniae. This is the bacteria that gives us pneumonia. And you can see the word streptococcus. In the word streptococcus, you can see the word coccus. So these are spherically shaped bacteria cells. And here's another one here, Magnetospirellum magnetotachytica. I don't know how to pronounce some of these words, but you can see again, the reason I'm showing you this is you can see in some of the names of bacteria, you can figure out what their shape is based on their name. Magnospirellum, well, that's the genus name. And so I would bet that all the bacteria in this genus are spiral shaped. When we look at how bacteria reproduce, well, bacteria reproduce through what's called binary fission. It's an asexual reproduction where one cell simply splits into two cells. You can see this animation of one bacteria cell dividing slowly, going through various stages, and becoming two cells. So we talked about this earlier in the school year when we were learning about meiosis and mitosis. Well, binary fission is very similar to mitosis in that both cells that are created have identical sets of DNA. They're clones, they're exact duplicates of one another. So the downside of reproducing this way is that the individuals that are created have less genetic diversity. Now there's an obvious upside, an obvious benefit of reproducing asexually is that you don't need another partner. So you're able to reproduce and carry on your species existence without the help of another partner. Now, one thing I want to mention is even though it says that the bacteria cells created are identical and that this leads to less genetic diversity, bacteria have actually figured out a way to add genetic diversity to themselves. Bacteria do this process called conjugation, and in the animation we got a yellow cell on the left and an orange cell on the right, and the yellow has penetrated the orange cell. And when the yellow cell penetrates the orange cell, you're going to notice that the yellow cell will transfer a red circular object to the cell on the right. That red circular object represents a plasmid, which is DNA of bacteria. So bacteria can actually do the process called conjugation, where the bacteria cell on the left penetrates the bacteria cell on the right. The two cells connect to one another by what's called the sex pilus. Remember, pilus is the singular version of the word, pili is the plural version. So one of the things that we mentioned a few minutes ago when we first started these notes was that the pili are used for attachment. Well, one way that bacteria use their pili to attach is in conjugation. After they connect, you can see again in the animation, the cell on the left has transferred a red circular object to the cell on the right. That red circular object is called a plasmid, and it's basically DNA of the bacteria on the left transferred to the bacteria on the right. So this process is how bacteria can create genetic diversity. One thing I do want to make clear is that conjugation is not really a form of reproduction. Look in the animation. At the beginning of the animation, there are two cells. At the end of the animation, there are still two cells. So conjugation is not really reproduction because they're not making more of themselves. But conjugation is how bacteria can exchange their DNA. When it comes to reproduction, bacteria reproduce by what's called binary fission. When we look at nutrition, how do bacteria obtain their nutrients? Well, there's a few patterns that we see. We see that many of them are heterotrophs. We brought up the term earlier in the school year called saprophytes, and that they feed on dead matter. So bacteria and fungus are saprophytic. They feed on dead matter. They decay. They cause dead organisms to decay, like dead trees, fallen leaves, animals that may have died. Will decay and feed on their dead body. These are what we call saprophytes, and bacteria are good examples. Well, also some bacteria are parasites. Here you see somebody's leg and foot with a very nasty parasitic bacteria infection. And hopefully for this person, their body was able to respond well to the antibiotics, and hopefully the person was able to keep their foot. But often there are some real nasty bacteria out there by the name of flesh-eating bacteria, and like their name implies, they eat flesh. They're parasitic and they eat flesh. Sometimes, unfortunately, body parts have to be amputated because the bacteria infection can be so devastating. Some bacteria, however, are autotrophs, and there's a group of autotrophic bacteria. There's a group of bacteria called cyanobacteria. We'll learn about them another day. Cyanobacteria perform photosynthesis, and like any kind of autotroph, they use the energy from the sun. They perform photosynthesis, and they turn water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight into glucose. And in the process of doing that, they also create a waste molecule called oxygen. So one thing I want to mention, whether they're heterotrophic, whether they're autotrophic, they're really essential to healthy ecosystems. Here we see a diagram I hope you recognize from earlier in the school year. Remind ourselves that bacteria play a vital role in the nitrogen cycle. If you look in the picture, that there are bacteria all over this picture that perform what's called nitrogen fixation, where they convert the nitrogen that's in the air into forms that are more usable to life. Let's also remember that earlier in the school year we learned about food webs. Well, here's a food web right here, and at the very bottom of this food web we can see bacteria. Bacteria are important decomposers in returning nutrients back into the ecosystem. So there's a couple things I just wanted you to keep in mind as we go through and learn about bacteria. Not all bacteria are harmful and cause disease, like you saw in that person's infected foot a few minutes ago. Well, how do bacteria use oxygen? How do they do respiration? Well, there's three groups of bacteria we see. First of all, here we have a test tube filled with like a chicken broth, chicken noodle soup broth. And you can see that there's these little black dots at the top of the test tube. Well, those are bacteria, and you can see that they're growing near the top, near the loose-fitting cap. Because the cap is loose, oxygen from the outside can get into that test tube, and the bacteria use that oxygen for their cellular needs. And so we call bacteria that have to have oxygen, we call them obligate aerobic. Aerobic means they use oxygen, and think of obligate like they're obligated to use oxygen. Well, here's another pattern that we see. We also see other bacteria that are just the opposite. They cannot live in oxygen. Here in this picture, the black dots in the picture, these are bacteria, and they're at the very bottom of the test tube. They're trying to use their flagella and swim down to the very bottom of the test tube away from the oxygen. For these groups of bacteria, oxygen is actually poison and toxic and will kill them. So they're swimming purposely to the bottom of that test tube, trying to get away from the loose-fitting cap where there's oxygen near the top. So some bacteria cannot live in oxygen whatsoever. We'll talk more about these bacteria another day. And then there's the bacteria that can go either way. These are called the facultative aerobic. Also heard them called facultative anaerobic. The picture says anaerobic. My notes in your book say aerobic. I've heard it go both ways as long as you remember the facultative. And in the picture at the bottom of the test tube we can see there are some bacteria living near the bottom. So some bacteria are avoiding the oxygen and they're swimming down to the bottom of the test tube. However, most of the bacteria are growing near the oxygen. So even though facultative anaerobic can live with or without, you can see from the picture the vast majority of the bacteria prefer oxygen. They're more efficient in their cellular needs. When we look at this picture right here, there's a picture of the bacteria called tuberculosis. Actually, there's a bacteria that causes the disease called tuberculosis, and the bacteria that causes tuberculosis lives inside of your lungs. So tuberculosis is actually fairly common, and it says in the question here, the bacteria that causes TB lives in your lungs. TB is tuberculosis. So from those three definitions right there, because it lives in your lungs, which one do you think it is? Well, I hope you chose this option right here, obligate aerobic, simply because if the bacteria lives in the person's lungs, and you know lungs take in oxygen, they're going to have to be able to survive with oxygen. So as we wrap up these notes, let's just take a moment to pause and ask you, okay, from this picture, what shape is that? Yeah, it's the spherical shape, but what's the name for it? Here's the answer in 3, 2, 1. Again, these are called cocci. Cocci is plural, coccus is singular. Here's another question. Name this bacteria shape. These are the rod-shaped bacteria. I'm going to show the answer in 3, 2, 1. So the rod-shaped bacteria are called bacillus. Again, bacillus is singular, bacilli is plural. So in this picture here, you can see dozens and dozens and dozens of little tiny threads going around the outside of this bacteria cell. Name these parts. I hope you know these are the parts called the pili. Pili is plural, pilus is singular, and bacteria often have hundreds of these pili in order to attach themselves. And the last one, name this process that is shown in the animation. In the animation, the DNA is separating, the cells starting to divide right down the middle, and ultimately you got pop, 2 new daughter cells. And so name this process that's shown in this animation. I hope you know this is called binary fission. Binary fission. And now that we've reached the end, go ahead and pause the video and try to answer these questions right here. If you're in my class, bring your answers to me before or after school one day. I'd be happy to check them for accuracy. Go ahead and pause the video. Good luck.